Welcome back, everybody. Quick break, mental break, and now ready for more. We are now to our lesson 2. We did our introduction to apologetics, and then this time we're going to go specifically into how a philosopher would look at the evidence. So each one of these lessons, like he kind of introed, we're going to come at it from a different approach. And so what we're trying to do is put ourselves in the shoes of different people and different experts. So if you didn't know Christianity much, or you forgot about it, and then you went off to higher education, and let's say you're just someone who loves to think about philosophy and the big questions of life, and it's caused you to struggle with the big claims made by the Bible. Today we're going to see arguments and questions that we could ask that may open the mind of a philosopher. So that might be you, partly. You're asking tough questions, so this could be something that helps you think about some of these concepts. But ultimately what we want to do is prepare our ability so that we can reach out to someone else who is a philosopher in their own mind. So for our first part of the video, we're going to look at the definition of philosophy, the word worldview and what that means, and then 5 criteria to judge a worldview. So I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Winkler as he starts it, and we'll watch our first section of this video to get us started.
Welcome back to our study of apologetics. During our first lesson, we discussed what apologetics is and gave some reasons why we should carry out the apologetic task. As we go forward, we're going to put ourselves into the shoes of certain occupations or vocations, like a philosopher, or an artist, or an historian, and ask the question, how do they look at the claims of the Bible, that God exists, that Jesus is God's Son, and rose from the dead? Today, we'll talk about philosophy. Next time, we'll talk about how a historian would look at the evidence. Then we'll go to a lawyer, a scientist, and we'll end with an artist. So let's start with philosophy. Philosophy, simply put, is the love of wisdom. Truthfully, we're all philosophers. If you think about yourself in the world, well, you're doing philosophy. So as a philosopher, how do we look at the claims that Jesus rose from the dead and that God existed and created this world? How would a philosopher take a look at the evidence? Now, a philosopher is going to talk about a thing called a worldview. A worldview, simply put, is how you view the world. And there are as many worldviews as there are people who have ever lived. We all have our own view of the world. And yet, there are commonalities between these worldviews. In a moment, we're going to talk about 4 main worldviews that we encounter in the Western world. There are many others, but for our purposes, we'll just talk about those 4. Let's explain what a worldview is just a little bit further first. A worldview is an overarching story that explains the world to us. A worldview may have a beginning, it may have the end, in between, it may give us a sense of belonging. It may have a moral code, tells us how to live. It may give us something to inspire to. What is the highest good? What does it mean for a human being to flourish? The first worldview that we'd like to talk about is called theism. Theism states that there is a God and that this God is personal. What do we mean by a personal God? Think of God as a person, not a human being, but a person with a personality. This is a God that can talk to you, a God that can interact. So theism is the belief in a personal God. The second worldview is deism. Deism believes that there is a God, but that this God is impersonal. This God cannot and does not interact with the world. The deist God created this universe, set everything into motion, and let it go, and said goodbye, and never would interact with it again. The third worldview is not technically a worldview, but it's more of a way of thinking. It's called agnosticism. It comes from the Greek word for not having knowledge. So an agnostic would say, I don't know if there is a God or not. I don't know if Jesus rose from the dead or not. Agnosticism tries to live life by not answering those big questions, specifically if God exists or not. The fourth main worldview is naturalism. A naturalist believes that there is only nature. There's only physical things. There isn't a spiritual realm, so there is no God, there is no soul, no spirit, no miracles, no angels, no afterlife. And if you keep pulling that string, there actually is no right or wrong, no love, no courage, no patience, all the things that we use to describe our souls and our interactions with other people who have souls. A naturalist would say, those are just words that we use to describe the biological functions in our body and in our brains. So theism believes in a personal God. Christianity is theistic, but so is Islam and Judaism. Deism believes in an impersonal God. Agnostics ignore the question of whether there is a God or not, and a naturalist believes that there is no God. So when I approach my skeptical friend, I have to understand that he or she has a worldview. And we want to be humble about our own worldview. We certainly don't know everything, and we want to make sure that we are not being arrogant and trying to push our worldview on somebody else. At the same time, we have a few bits of criteria we can use to judge if a worldview is accurate or not, good or not. Let's talk about 5 of them. The first criteria is this worldview coherent? I'll give you an example of incoherence. If I said, why don't you come over to my house and we'll barbecue rainbows, that doesn't make sense. Or if I asked you, what's the smell of the color blue, you would understand this is not coherent. So if a worldview is incoherent, that's a check mark against it. The second criteria is the worldview comprehensive? Does it tell me about the beginning and the end? Does it give me a moral code? So maybe, for example, I would look at the naturalistic worldview and I would criticize it by saying, it doesn't really give me a good answer of the beginning. Where did all this stuff come from? And it doesn't have a moral code that I can follow, because there truthfully is no right or wrong. It's just we use those words to describe our society. So I would say it's not comprehensive. The third criteria is it internally consistent. Now, truthfully, we all have our inconsistencies. But if the worldview says that all human beings are created equal and they should be treated equally, and yet in society we're okay with people being judged because of the color of their skin or their gender or something like that, that's inconsistent, and that's a check mark against somebody's worldview. The next criteria is it externally consistent? Are there bits of evidence outside the worldview that can corroborate the worldview? Now, every worldview is going to have things that you can't really prove scientifically. That's just the way it is. We all go by faith in a certain way. But if your worldview believes in the existence of unicorns and unicorns don't exist, that's kind of a check mark against your worldview. Now, the last criteria I think is really important, even though it's not as easily determined. The fifth criteria is, what does the worldview inspire? If a worldview inspires intellectual curiosity and freedom and love and human rights, that seems to me to be a good worldview. But if the worldview inspires hate and violence and injustice, that would not be a very good worldview. Now, there's a caveat here. we have to understand that if somebody abuses a worldview, it doesn't mean that the worldview itself is wrong. Certainly there are Christians who have done very bad things. That doesn't mean that Christianity is wrong. Just because it abused Christianity doesn't make it wrong. So we can use these criteria to help us understand and to maybe even challenge somebody's worldview and say, is it consistent? Is it coherent? Is it comprehensive? Does it match up with external evidence? And what does it inspire? Before we end, I'd like to talk one more thing about faith and reason. The truth is that we all go by faith. Even the hardest atheist goes by faith. The atheist believes that what they see and hear, the empirical evidence that comes from their senses, is real. We call that natural faith. Even if they can't prove it with certainty, they still go by faith. But then there is the supernatural faith. That is the Holy Spirit coming into our hearts and changing our hearts to trust Jesus. And so your atheist friend, well, he believes too. It's not a question of being a believer or an unbeliever. It's a question of what do you believe, or better yet, whom do you trust? And I think that's a way to challenge the worldview of maybe your skeptical friends. We all go by faith. The question is, what do we believe? Whom do we trust? Let's take a moment to discuss what a worldview is, and maybe even take a look at your own worldviews and compare them to those criteria, and maybe compare them to other worldviews.
Thoughts, questions about worldview, those worldviews, those different criteria to judge a worldview? Go ahead, Ed.
What is it, deism? I mean, who do we know, or what religions really check,
Founding fathers. Many of the founding fathers were deists. So we talk about them being some were more Christian than others, but most would say that they believe that there was a God, but that he wasn't actively involved in our present day. That was our job. So they kind of would talk about that a God started the world and that we live in a framework that has certain rules, inalienable rights. But that we, as the agents in this time, are responsible for acting on that natural order versus going against that in disorder. So historically, we talk about many of them being deists. So talking about any modern religion, I think deists, a lot of times, I don't know if I can point to one because they don't really necessarily believe in religion. It's just they allow for there being the presence of God, but that he is someone who started it and we are the ones who are the agents of our own destiny still. They'll just allow for the supernatural. So it's kind of like an agnostic, except they'll say more than we don't know that there's a God or there is a God. They'll say that there is a God. He's just uninvolved today. So they would claim it would be a cop-out for us to just have God do everything where we should take more personal responsibility. The danger is then you put it all on your shoulders to save yourself or to fix the world. And the Bible doesn't allow us to do that either because we can't. We can't fix ourselves or the world. Good question.
Aren't there even churches that call them agnostic?
Are there churches where the people in it are agnostics? Is that what you're asking?
Seems to me I heard that.
I think you may be right. I think there probably are. I don't know if they call themselves churches or just like a club. Because I'm sure there are. I'm sure there are groups because there's pretty much groups around every philosophy, just like there is any historical society or whatever. So I guarantee there is. I'd be curious to know what that church would call itself. But I'm sure you're right.
Is it agnostic? I mean, G-N-O without the A? Isn't there a...
Yeah, so Gnosticism is different than agnostics.
That's what I'm wondering if that's what we're...
So there could be that difference too. Like so Gnosticism was an early church heresy where they believed that the physical doesn't matter. Gnosticism believed that the soul and the inner things were what mattered. And so they really got into the secret inner knowledge, and you were finding this deeper spiritual knowledge, and so you were seeking that. And so it was kind of Christian, but then what ended up happening is they're just like, you can do whatever you want with your body because it doesn't matter. Because material is bad, spirit is good. And this started creeping in right away, and so actually in John's letters, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, he's talking against that idea. They also then messed with Jesus a little bit, because then Jesus' human nature was not really good. It was just his God spirit, and so they poo-pooed that he was actually human, because human's bad. Like bodies are bad, so he didn't have a real body, it was just a spiritual body. So they kind of created that heresy that Jesus wasn't fully God and fully man. So that's a little bit different of a thread. So Gnosticism, that means knowledge, that word. So they had secret knowledge. Or agnostics, they just admit they don't have the knowledge. They don't know if God is real or not. They leave it as an open question. And would even say maybe so far as you can't know that God's real or not because you can't prove it. So they would probably go that far to say that too.
Isn't that what a lot of the Apocrypha is based off of? The Gnostic ideals?
I think some of it is, yep. He said, isn't that what some of the Apocrypha is based on? And I said, I think so. I think you're right. And some of that's like just history of that time, but it's definitely not inspired. It's very interesting. Good questions. A lot of people today, I would say, just like if I'm looking at our culture, I normally am expecting a lot of agnostics or naturalists. And naturalists, I was going to write atheism right under there, but they're a little bit different. Like a naturalist expects that there's only a natural explanation for anything. But I guess it doesn't necessarily mean you completely deny that God exists. It's just you expect that he works in natural ways and he's not going to break that. Because I've heard some Christians will say, so the stars are moving out from the earth. And so some people will be like, well, doesn't that speak to a big bang? Things are still flying apart. And then sometimes Christians will say that, we should allow for this because this is the way we can harmonize it. The stars are falling out, so maybe this is just a naturalist way that God created the world, is he used this natural thing, and that's why it's still happening, so we have to allow for millions and billions of years. That's a naturalist argument. So you're kind of limiting God and saying, well, God has to follow his own rules. So I see this evidence, so that must mean it happened in this Big Bang way. I know you're pushing it a little too far. One, you don't have all the information. And you're forcing a naturalist explanation on God when he's the one who created nature. So it's like putting God in his own box. Like God made a box and he has to go in it and he has to stay in it. Otherwise he's a bad God. That doesn't make sense to me. You can't put God in a box, even if he's the one who created the rules. But it seems sometimes people want to do that based on the evidence that they see. Any other ideas on maybe the judging of a worldview? That's pretty heavy, deep concepts.
Would you consider Darwin and Darwinism, would you consider that then as a naturalist?
Yes. Yep. So that's a naturalist worldview, that everything develops by chance over time. Yep.
So there's no morality at all, and everything is survival of the fittest. That
Yes.
whole life, everything happens, whether it's your personal or society. So
Yep. It's all consequence, instinct, the best way to survive. And that is a very popular worldview. Without even realizing it, you guys are infected with that, because that permeates everything. That we should do what's best for society. Every time I listen to a historian or something, they're explaining things that way, where they'll be like, yep, this is why humans do this, because back when we were cavemen, this helped us survive, so that's why we have this instinct in our brains to run away from danger. That's a naturalist explanation for that. Versus saying God gave us a smart system that we do have this natural reaction to protect ourselves, but it doesn't necessarily go back to when we were cavemen. It's just the fact that God created us very intelligent and responsive to our environment. So it's a different origin point. But that happens all the time when I listen to, I listen to the Huberman Lab. It's a podcast. He's a scientist, and he has all these different scientists on, and they always, by default, talk about us having all of these tendencies in our brain because we developed from monkeys, and back then we needed this, and now it's a bad thing, or something like that. They'll use it that way. But yeah, that's a naturalist understanding. So that's a good example of how to push it. So if everything is natural and we just came by instinct and we're just evolved from monkeys and there is no morality, we just do what's best for us. That's where he says, now you test it, let's judge it. Does that work, that worldview work internally and externally? Do you love your children simply because they're going to continue your family line and your race? Because that would be the naturalist argument. That you want to have kids because you want to perpetuate. And then even when you think of it that way, what benefit does that give for you as an individual? If those kids aren't productive and work hard, then shouldn't we just eat our young like other animals? They'll give us food. They're not good for anything else. They can't, they don't have any good skills. Let's get rid of them. So when you press that out, if everything's just about my survival, then we look at our society and even how secular people treat their children or the things around them. We don't interact with humans like that. Sometimes we do. Sometimes we're very selfish. We have that natural tendency, but we don't just kill people willy-nilly. We want to have a peaceful society. We want to love people beyond the people we have to love. So that challenges that naturalistic worldview, that there's something deeper in us that wants to be good and kind and build a society that's good for more than just me. Those are bigger moral things. That's not an instinct thing. So where does that come from? So to me, that would be a good challenge against someone who's saying everything just happened naturally. Or just things you can't explain. Anytime something happens that seems supernatural, how does a naturalist explain that? Well, we must not have enough information. Exactly. You don't have enough information. There is more going on. So. Go ahead, Ed.
Another argument I've heard that works with that whole naturalist view is the idea of when you push somebody that has that opinion, the question is, and what do you believe in, or what thing that you find very detestable? Say, if you're a woman, the idea of a woman's rights. In another culture, women have very little right, but here in Western society, we value women and their rights. So, what makes yours better than theirs? Why is your view of that different than, say, somebody in another culture? And then it gets really down to that whole idea of morality, and we value that morality part of it, so then that argument starts to fall apart, because what makes one better for society or even for the individuals? the individual.
That's such a good point, because you have to start talking in a way that this is objectively better for everybody, and you can't do that unless you believe in objective morality. Because if you're believing it's just good for the society, well, who are we to say what's good for their society? Which is why we've, in recent times, kind of edited away history and saying the colonists were terrible, and we can't say anything negative about a Native American lifestyle before us or the Aztec people. It was just all their own version of society. Because we're not allowed to say anything is objectively evil, or that one worldview is better than the other. But as Christians, we do believe that our worldview is better. That doesn't give us the right to kill people for not subscribing to it, and that's where he said some people have used worldviews the wrong way. But that doesn't mean that the Christian worldview is not good for the world. And we haven't been willing to say that much in the last 8-10 years. It's just been something that it's taboo to say. But Western Christianity and the Western world very much believed they were superior to other worldviews. And we're uncomfortable even saying that out loud. But we do, because we believe the Christian worldview comes from the Bible, which comes from God. Are there abuses inside of the Western Christian world? Absolutely, because there's humans in the Western Christian world. There's going to be abuse. But that doesn't mean that there's not objective truth there that's better than other worldviews. And if you go back to, for example, I mentioned the Aztec people. So people will criticize Cortez coming in and wiping out the Aztec people. Well, let's zoom into that historical picture just for a second. And I'm not saying it was right that he destroyed a lot of that people right away. But do you know what he saw when he got there? Those Aztec ziggurat pyramid things, they were slaughtering people to their gods to gain power. They were doing sick, terrible rituals to their own people. And then when they came in and captured any of the Europeans that were coming, they would sacrifice them too. I mean, the culture was extremely satanic and scary. So to say that those were equal and that was just their opinion, okay, but I'm not willing to say that. Sacrificing my own children. I'm not willing to say that that's at the same level as the Christian worldview and how Jesus teaches us to treat one another. And we don't just arbitrarily kill people for our own good. But that's what they were doing, and that's what he saw. And he went back and said, we need to get this out of here. This is satanic. It will infect everybody. And that's the reality of evil, is it festers. So that's where I kind of shoot that whole argument of just saying arbitrarily that every worldview is fine. Again, that worldview does not count for there being real truth. And according to Christianity and the Bible, there is real truth, substantial truth that's grounded in God. So it's a very different worldview. But the way Europe and the way modern America is thinking, it's much more Darwinian than it is Christian. So watch out for that. Anytime someone's saying we do this for survival or to get ahead, all of that's like Darwinian type thinking. But Christianity is not about just me getting ahead. So it affects capitalism a bit too, so you got to be careful. Our life is not just about us ever. Our life is about service and love for our fellow man. That is the Christian worldview. So we have to constantly just be careful on where all these ideas are coming from. All right, let's keep going. Next section will be on cosmology.
Welcome back. I hope you had a good discussion about what a worldview is, and perhaps even got into a discussion about your own worldview. You're doing the work of a philosopher. Now let's get into an actual philosophical argument for the existence of God. This is called the cosmological argument for the existence of God. Now, before we get to the actual argument, we need to define cosmology and talk about one more thing, and that is causes. Cosmology is just the study of causes, cause and effect. In particular, what caused this universe? Why are we here rather than not here? This is the realm of cosmology. Now, again, before we get to the actual argument, let's talk about what causes are. When philosophers talk about causes, they talk about it in two different ways. The first way is cause and effect. So you imagine like a billiard ball that is hit and hits another billiard ball, and the cause of the hitting the billiard ball then has an effect, this billiard ball going this way. That's simple enough. But when philosophers talk about causes, they also mean descriptors of things. So let's talk about 4 different causes or descriptions to help explain something. So let's imagine that I have a dry erase marker in my hand. Now, when I take this marker and I want to explain its existence to you, I'm going to explain it with 4 causes or 4 descriptors. The first descriptor is the material cause. What is it made of? So imagine this marker, it's made of plastic, it has felt in it, and there's ink, and there's a cap. That's the stuff that it's made of. The second descriptor is the formal cause. What form did this marker take? The form is a writing utensil. A crayon is a writing utensil, but would be made of different material. A pen and a pencil is made of different material, but all of those things are like the marker, it is a writing utensil. So I've told you what it's made of, and I told you the form. The next descriptor is the efficient cause. Now I need to tell you how it got here, how it was made. Well, it has a lot of efficient causes, this marker that I'm showing you. This marker had raw materials that were mined. This marker had somebody who invented it, who designed it, who actually manufactured it. It also has somebody that packaged it up, and the truck driver that drove it to the place, and the person who opened the package and placed that marker into my hand. All of those are efficient causes. I've explained how it was made and how it got here. Now, a lot of people want to stop right there and say we can fully explain things by telling you the material it's made of, what form it takes, and how it was made and how it arrived. But imagine this marker is at a school, and it's right on the sill of a whiteboard. To fully explain the existence of that particular marker, I need to ask one more question, and that's the why question. Why is it here? And the answer, to fully explain the existence of that particular marker, the answer is education. If there was no such thing as education, that particular marker would not exist. This is called the teleological or final cause or descriptor. Think telescope when we think of the word telos from the Greek. I'm going to the end. Telos is the destiny, the goal, the purpose. It answers the why question. When Jesus was dying on the cross, he used a form of this word telos. He said tetelestai, which we translate as, it is finished. His purpose, his goal, his destiny was completed. So to fully explain, for instance, a human being, we need to ask the why question. Not just what we're made of, and what form that we take, or how we got here, our parents, but rather, what is my purpose? Why am I here? Now let's get to the argument, the cosmological argument for the existence of God. Simply put, the cosmological argument goes like this. Everything that exists began to exist, and everything that began to exist had a cause. Because things don't just pop into existence. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. Now this has to do with contingency. You didn't just pop into existence, but you're contingent on your parents. And your parents didn't just pop into existence, but they are contingent on your grandparents. And they are your great-grandparents, and so on. But we can't have what we call an infinite regress, and we keep going back from causes to causes to causes to causes. Eventually, most people think we have to have a beginning. We have to have an uncaused cause. So the argument goes like this. The universe began to exist, therefore it has a cause. And now the question is, what is that cause? Well, logically, that cause would have to be pretty powerful. I would think outside of time and space, uncaused. It's a free agent. It's creative. We may even go so far as to say it's smart, so that it's a person. Well, this sure sounds like what we call God. And so the cosmological argument says things don't just pop into existence They had to have a cause, and that cause is God. Now, this argument has its flaws. First of all, this argument does not get us to Jesus Christ. It doesn't even get us to Christianity. It just gets us to the possibility that there is something out there, something beyond us, something perhaps divine. Also, philosophers would argue that we don't really understand cause and effect all that well. We can all think of examples when we thought something happened because of a certain cause, but then when we found out more information, we changed our mind. So maybe you could think of a medieval little village that has the plague, and they think that the cause of their problems, this plague, is because God is angry at them, and so they blame witches or something like that. They have the wrong cause. The more information we got, the better we understand what the causes of those diseases were. It's even more complicated than that. When I look at a table, I think that it's static, that is, it's not moving. And if I knock on it, I think that it's solid. But when we get down to the molecular level, we understand that things are always moving and that there's a lot of empty space there. So philosophers, when they are approached with this cosmological argument for the existence of God, sometimes will dismiss it and say, well, we don't really know cause and effect all that well, and so this argument doesn't hold up. But my counter argument to that is, but we're still here, and there's tables in front of us, and I don't really believe that things just pop into existence. And so I think that the cosmological argument for the existence of God has a lot of value. Once again, things that began to exist have causes. You and I began to exist. We have a cause. And in fact, this whole universe is made up of things that began to exist, and they have causes. And as we go back in this string of causes, eventually we got to get to something that was uncaused. Something that caused this thing, called the universe. Something outside of time and space. Something that's a free agent and creator. That sure sounds like God to me. Now, we're not yet to Jesus Christ, and there's the beautiful thing about Christianity, that this powerful, uncaused cause actually loves us and is willing to forgive us. That's the good news. Let's take some time to think about the cosmological argument. Do you think it's good or bad, valuable or not? I don't think there's a wrong answer on this one. So let's take some time and think about causes and cosmology.
How are your brains doing? Good? Okay. It hurts. I had to take a semester of philosophy at Martin Luther College, and I remember my brain hurting a lot. It is hard to read yourself or get yourself into the mind space of some of these deep philosophers because they just take it very deep. So the causes here reminded me of that, is you really have to understand what he's trying to get at here. Any questions or thoughts? First on the causes. I think that last cause is very important. He said like some people don't want to talk about that, called the teleological or the final cause, which is the why something is. Like, why does that exist? And that's a very important question to ask. We don't always have the answer for it, but it's extremely important. This is one that I love to ask when I'm discussing like evolution, for example. Because I think of an eye. Okay, let's just think we developed over millions of years. Let's just assume that I believe that. How did the builders of the eye, and I know that's silly because there's no builders of an eye, there's molecules. How did all the molecules get on the same page that they were all going to develop over millions of years and eventually be something? There's so many things in the eye that independently do nothing. I mean, they don't work unless they have every single part of it. So did all of these molecules have the intelligence to just be like, don't worry guys, hang in there, millions of years from now, we'll be something. and we'll be able to show everybody the world. You know, like, I think that is just a cause, because then what's the why for millions of years then? There isn't one. There was no reason for all of those molecules to be developing into an eye. And that's all contingent on there being a brain. Because if there's an eye without a brain, the eye doesn't do anything. And if there's not all the rest of the stuff happening in our body, neither of those have blood to function, to work, and it doesn't work. So that's an example of why it's so important to ask that question, the teleological cause, like, why? And even if you want to believe everything's by a natural cause, or like that's everything came just by material, you still have to wonder, why do you exist? And no one wants to say you're just an accident, you don't matter. So then what happens is we're like, yep, I developed from a monkey, but I want to have a purpose, as if a God loves me and has a plan for me. And it's good to push that. Like, you're not satisfied with just being an accident, are you? It's a pretty sad, scary world to live in. Doesn't matter if you live or die. No. You're just a blip. You're accidental. No, we want to believe there's destiny and there's purpose. Well, you can't do that without a God. Where does that purpose come from? So that's a different argument. And this one gives a cosmological argument. I think it's good in the sense I don't think anyone can ever get past it. You can say, like, well, we'll never know how it all started. Do you ever stop wondering where it all started? Which opens the door to at least considering that there is a supernatural, which just means there's something beyond you. And maybe that'll open the door just enough to be like, let's explore what that something you don't know is. He's right, though. It won't lead you to Jesus. Like, you can make that argument to someone like, oh, there's a God, it has to be to start the world. That doesn't mean he's going to believe in a Christian God. But maybe it'll open the door to someone who doesn't even want to think about God at all. Ed?
I was just going to say, out of all of those, you can go down that list, and most people are pretty comfortable just pushing them off, and it's not that big a deal until you get down to that last one. And then it points to them, like you said, you know, when you look at yourself and you go, well, why am I here? Why does it matter what I do and, you know, how I feel or what I think or whether I do something that's good or bad? When it gets down to that, then that's the thing. That's what opens it. Makes people question.
And even that being so fundamental, like for people to be happy, you think about one of the main causes of anxiety and depression is you don't feel like you have purpose. You lose your meaning. This is one of the things that scares everybody about AI. If AI takes our jobs away, what are we as humans? If a robot can do everything we're doing, what makes humans special? It's a scary question to consider until you're just like, well, we have a deeper purpose. Well, do we? What is it? And every human wants that. Where does that come from? That desire for purpose and meaning beyond just doing ordinary stuff. I would say it comes from God. It's hard to answer that without him. Any other comments on the causes and cosmology? Otherwise, we'll finish off with our third section. All right.
Welcome back. I hope that you had a fruitful discussion about the cosmological argument for the existence of God. That was some pretty heady stuff, wasn't it? Our next philosophical argument is called the anthropological argument for the existence of God. That's a big fancy word to describe human beings and how they interact in history. Maybe a simpler way to title this argument is to call it the moral argument for the existence of God. It goes like this. If moral, objective standards do not exist, then God does not exist. But moral, objective, absolute standards do exist. Therefore, God exists. Let me put it a different way. if you or your skeptical friend ever says, that's right or that's wrong, if you've ever looked at the world and say, that's not just, that's evil, if you've ever thought about something as good and beautiful and wonderful and morally pure, then you actually believe in a moral set of standards when it comes to right and wrong, good and evil. And so the question becomes, where did you get that absolute moral objective standard about good and evil and about right and wrong? If you say something's right or wrong, you're appealing to an objective, absolute standard. And where did that come from? Let's imagine that you're going to start a society. To start a society from scratch. And you're trying to decide, how should we live? What will be our laws? What will be our highest good? And you're going to try to ground that morality and that law on something. You have to build it on some sort of foundation. And there are only three options. Option number one is something below you. Option number two is something on your level. And option number three is something above you. The level below you would be nature. So perhaps you decide to create this society and its morals and its laws based on what you see happening in the world, in nature. And so you look around and you see this is how animals act, and this is how the world is ordered. This is how we're going to order our society. I hope that you already see that this is going to be problematic. When we look at the animal kingdom, we see some beautiful things, but we also see the survival of the fittest. We also see a thinning of the herd. We see things that we human beings would be appalled if we saw in our society. Let me give you an example. Let's say that you have a cat at home, and the cat finds a mouse, and he plays with the mouse, kills the mouse, and then drops the mouse in front of you. You would think that's probably pretty gross, but you wouldn't call the police to throw the cat into kitty prison. You understand that the animal kingdom is driven by instincts. There's predators and there's prey, and there's things that just occur in nature. It's the cycle of life. But if another human being took another human being, played with it, killed it, and dropped it in front of you, you wouldn't think that was gross. You would be horrified by that, and you would be calling the police. And so I don't think we can build a society based largely on what we see in nature, that is, things below us. That would be a pretty nasty and brutal society. So maybe we can build it on our level. And what I mean by grounding morality on our level is that we as a society, right, a group of people that's on my level, we're all above nature, that people on our level can decide what is right and wrong. Perhaps we vote, or we elect officials to write laws, to legislate laws, and we elect judges to adjudicate those laws. That's one way to judge a society right and wrong on our level. The other way to create a society with morals on our level is to say that every individual has their own truth, their own right and wrong. I hope you already see that there's going to be problems with this as well. What if one group decides that another group is not worth living? How could we judge that group for that heinous thought when they have made up their own moralities and have voted on it? You really have a problem with moral reformers if you create a society that bases its morality, its right and wrong, only by deciding by vote or elected officials what is eternally right and wrong, objectively an absolute standard. How could a civil rights worker in the 1960s from the North go down to the South, in Jim Crow South, and tell those people that they're wrong because they're treating people as second-class citizens just because of their color of their skin? You don't really have an opportunity to do moral reform because it's just your society versus my society, or even worse, my morality versus your morality. But what if I'm a murderer? What if I'm even worse? How could you ever judge me? So it seems that grounding our right and wrong, our good and evil, our absolute standards on our level is going to be problematic. In fact, we have a very important historical example of just that. After World War II, the victorious Allies wanted to persecute some of the Nazis in Germany for all the heinous things they did during the war and before the war, in particular, the extermination of Jewish people. Well, technically, the Nazis didn't do anything illegal because they just changed the laws in their society before they carried out those heinous acts. So how can you judge somebody in a courtroom when technically they didn't do anything illegal? And so they came up with this concept, and that is the law above the law. So now we have got to something above us. And this was the beginning of what we call international law. But the problem with international law is, who makes up international law? And so what we're all after, with the people who are saying this is unjust in our world, for any person who says that's unfair, for the people who are trying to throw the Nazis into prison, we're all trying to find an absolute standard. And what we're looking for is a reference point that is above us. Think about the sun as a reference point. So maybe you live 100 miles from me, and I cannot see you. But in the afternoon, both of us can see the sun if it's a sunny day. What we're looking for is an objective standard of right and wrong that becomes a reference point for all of society, so that we can judge what is right and wrong, what is good and evil. Now, once again, it's not a perfect argument, but this sure sounds like God, this reference point. That we have a law that's written in all of our hearts, no matter what religion a person is, no matter what culture they come from. We have a general sense of right and wrong, that it's always wrong to lie, that it's always wrong to murder. Where did that come from? It seems that a very good answer to that is God. And this is the moral argument for the existence of God. Now, how does maybe a naturalist think about morality? Well, the way they think about morality is through the lens of evolution. And the idea there is that the goal is keeping the species going through the generations. And so that anything that helps us with that survival, ends up being something good. But a true naturalist would never say that there is an actual right or wrong, good or evil. It's just that we give words like good or evil to these evolutionary instincts. But I think you and I don't really like that. We're not buying what they're selling. Because you're saying the murderer is not just wrong, he's just bad for society and the continuation of the species. But I think we all understand that it's more than just it's bad for society. It actually is wrong. Let's take a moment now to discuss the moral argument for the existence of God.
Just gets heavier. We actually talked quite a bit about this. So we brought it up earlier too, talking about this moral argument and where you get your morals from, that objective truth. Where does it come from? If it doesn't come from God, where does that come from? Why, if we're in different cultures, do we all feel it's wrong to murder another human being for no reason? Maybe he was looking at me funny. Who are you to tell me that's wrong? No, we know that's wrong. Or like stealing someone's possessions. We know that that's wrong. Is there disagreement on some of those absolute truths? Yes, that's why we have fights about this, and because we're all sinful. But it makes sense to us who believe in a God that we have a reference point in the sense that we were all designed by one creator to live a certain way, that there's a built-in right and wrong into our natural world and into our own design. This all makes sense with our worldview. So the challenge then is, if you don't have God, how does that make sense? And I have yet to hear even a close, good response to that. That's what I like about that moral argument. I haven't heard a good one. I don't think there is a good one. So where does that come from? And the closest I've heard people get, but it just sounds like God, is they'll be like, well, man, our bodies are amazing, and how they've evolved is so outstanding, and we've evolved as a society, and we've learned to be, pretty tolerant in this or that. But do we see that in the world? Are things generally getting better? Are we getting along? And the more advanced we get, does everyone get nicer? Do our problems just disappear? Do we really, so there's so many holes in that argument. I don't know. I think it's hard to explain it without, like you said, a reference point. And to me, that sounds like God. I don't know what else you would call it. Aliens? Beaming information into us? Well, at that point, if that's all aliens are to you, that still sounds like God to me. So you're trying to find something that you don't know exists. You sound a lot like a religious person coming up with their own religion. So, anyway, that's how I feel about that. Any other thoughts on that? Otherwise, I'll let him finish off.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good question to ask. I know when I ask someone if they believe in right and wrong, pretty much everybody says they do, because, if you say you don't, then there's, like you're saying, a whole bunch of problems with that, and that can kind of lead into both sin, with people seeing that wrong is wrong for a reason, and it can also kind of show that their worldview, like that's a contradiction. Like,
Exactly.
Why is it right and wrong if we all just evolved from nothing and it's survival of the fittest? So
Yeah.
I think that's a very helpful question.
And I think when you press that, because sometimes it's good to press that worldview, just like you said, the conclusions you're going to come to, if it's just survival of the fittest, you're not going to be comfortable with that. Because where you get then is a society you don't want to live in. And then that contradicts even your own feelings. Like, that's not a worldview that serves you. That kind of goes back to that final clause, is like, why? Or he was saying with in the first part, when you judge a worldview, what does this worldview inspire? And what I wrote down is, how does this worldview serve you? So even on a practical, if you think that everything's happened by chance, how does that serve you practically? Kind of a scary world to live in. But as a Christian, I can say my worldview serves me very well, because when bad things happen, I recognize that's the effect of sin. And that's something I won't have to deal with when I get to heaven. And I'm a part of that, but I have a Savior who takes that away. So my worldview serves me really well. It's going to clean me from my own sin. It's going to save me from the sin out there. And it'll save you too. So I think my worldview is good for me and you. So even in a practical sense, I like that. Thank you. All right, we'll finish this video up and then close out.
Welcome back. I hope that you had a good discussion about morals. I personally think that this is the best philosophical argument for the existence of God. And thanks for going through all this philosophy. I know that it's pretty high-level stuff, and you should be proud of yourself for thinking about cosmology and anthropology. Those are pretty big words. But at the same time, it's really simple, isn't it? We're all philosophers. We all ask these questions of how should we live, what is right and wrong, where have I come from, and where am I going, and where do I belong? These worldview type questions. And I think your friends, well, I know that they have a worldview. And their worldview is going to be flawed, just like we all have flawed worldviews. And I think that you can help them say, and help them think, and help them get to the point where you say, but this is right or wrong. Or for instance, how did we even get here in the first place? And I think those are opportunities to talk about God, and specifically a God who loves them. And even though these philosophical arguments for the existence of God didn't get us to Jesus Christ, you can get them to Jesus Christ by saying, but there's good news in all of this, that there is a Creator, and this Creator loves us, that there is a right and wrong, and yet we have a Savior that forgives us when we do what is wrong. I hope that this was beneficial for you, and it gets you thinking a little bit more. And the more you think about what you would say to your skeptical friend, and maybe when the time is right, you'll be able to put a rock in their shoe.
All right, my friends, any final comments or thoughts about the philosophical arguments and anything more about that today?
Yeah.
Yeah, go
One
ahead.
thing to me, it just kind of reminds me of like not believing in God is kind of like being satisfied or content in a way with it all being flat and not having a depth.
Sure. Yeah, being satisfied or afraid to go deeper into those questions because they don't lead you in places that you feel
The
comfortable
unknown
talking
and-
about. Yeah, it's scary.
Not understandable. But yet it still is.
Yep. And then it's
To
hard
have
because if
like
you
a
stay.
body to be able to just keep itself going just because you eat and breathe and
It's outstanding.
like-
Yeah.
beyond understanding. However it
And that's I would agree with you. I think when you press yourself into any of those really tough questions, pretty soon you just realize the limitations of the greatest scientists and the most information, that there's so many holes in our understanding of the world. And pretty quick you have to allow for there to be a supernatural level to our existence. There has to be more. There has to be a soul. There has to be meaning. There has to be a creator. Because without it, nothing actually makes sense. Unless you're just looking at it flat, 2D, playing Mario, and not asking how the tube TV works and how it got there. Just settling with the picture in front of you. Awesome.
Well,
But-
and you
yeah,
look
go
and
ahead.
you figure out the deeper details, but it's like then it stops there at a point way down here, but it still stops. It's a dead end.
Yep. Awesome. All right, let's close with prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, please bless us with the information we heard and help us absorb it a little bit at a time and think through these arguments. And for the group in front of me, I hope that it's a comforting thing, because Christianity and Jesus really fills out these arguments in a very positive way. Like our video said, these arguments by themselves don't bring us to Jesus, but the questions they ask can drive us even further into Him and His truth. Because we do know that the world is created by a good God, that He did design this world specifically and make it in 6 days very intelligently and beautifully to work together into a beautiful place for us to live, that did get twisted by sin but will one day be restored by the work that He has done by suffering and dying and rising for us, so that ultimately we believe that our true destiny, our purpose, will be restored to us as a perfected humanity in heaven. And that is all possible because of Jesus, the perfect one, our Savior, who came into this world in our place and did everything right and perfect for us, to walk back the pain and to restore the beautiful design that God started this world with. That helps us understand why there is immorality, why we feel that things are wrong, because they are wrong, and that one day God will make it right. So help us find great comfort and joy in that, and to share that layer of that with those that do ask these questions and are struggling. We pray this in Jesus' name and ask you to hear us. Amen.